and welcome. I'm so glad you came for our great program on Lucretia Mott. She's a fabulous woman who has a history in our town. And our great Vice President, Robert, is going to tell you all about her. Before that, a few announcements. First of all, the Dutchess County Tavern Tour. We had a great meeting at Charlotte's in July, and so we heard all about the prohibition and temperance.
And we had the highest attendance of any of them
So far,
over a year and a half.
So far, yeah, we had the highest attendance there. And it was really a good meeting. And we learned about the Methodist Church. We were actually in the church, so that was really nice. And the next one is at Dutchess Spirits, which is in Pine Plains, and that's on October 13th this year. Okay? You know, it's often, because it's where it's on a old chicken farm where they were doing the bootlegging. So it's hidden back on a dirt road, and I don't know, I don't have directions, but I'll try to get them for you. But yes.
I have handouts that are from the Tavern Tour, from Dutchess County Tavern Tour anyway. You can pick this up, and it has it down the bottom. It's the last Tavern Tour of the year.
Okay, does that have directions to it? Or?
No, but it, you know, it's official.
Okay. And then on October 7th in Dover Plains, they're having a dinner, catered dinner by As You Wish, and it's at Tabor Wing House, which is right across from the fire station. And that was between 3 and 7 p.m. and costs $35 a person. And they want you to make reservations by the 1st, I believe, October 1st, right. So if anybody's interested in more information on that, I can get it to you. The other thing is the Dutchess County Historical Society is having a big Year of the Veteran. We're going to be celebrating not celebrating, I should say, but it's World War I. Honoring our veterans and honoring all our veterans after that, from then on. It starts now and is going forward. They're also setting up a oral history program, and they're working with BARD students, and they're going to have a BARD mobile van to take oral histories of veterans. And so you'll be hearing more of that. We're looking for family members of descendants of our veterans of World War I, and to see much more memorabilia and history that we can get from the town and the village on World War I. So you'll all be hearing from that as we go forward. But we'll probably be doing programs. We're having a program committee coming up on what day is it, Allison, the 11th?
Yes.
On October 11th, we're going to have a program committee meeting at the bookstore at 4 p.m. Anybody have any programs you are interested in us pursuing, or you would like to pursue yourself and present? We'd love to hear from you. Anything else?
They can join us at the meeting.
They can join us at the meeting, of course. David?
Thank you. Just an announcement, some of you know this already, but on October 10th, there is going to be a special meeting at the firehouse. It's open to everyone to come and share ideas for the possible uses of the Thorne building. And the more people who are there to talk about it, the better. And speaking of that, the library has coordinated on the 30th of the month, 2 o'clock on the 30th, a presentation in the library proper about the school, and is inviting anyone, Marion, who graduated from there to come and share stories about teachers, experiences, and we've got photographs from classes as well as current photographs of the way the building looks now. So once again, that's open to the public, everyone's invited. It's the 30th, 2 o'clock at the library.
Which month?
This month, so it's next week, basically.
I thought so, but I just wanted to be
Yeah,
sure.
that's September 30th for the library, and then October 10th for the meeting at the firehouse.
Jonathan, you want to have an announcement to make?
Yeah, tomorrow, Saturday and Sunday is the Antique Machinery Show, Kent, Connecticut. There's something there for everybody, it's terrific. 1 mile north of Kent on Route 7.
Okay, Kent, Connecticut, 1 mile north of the village.
Starts tomorrow,
Weekend,
through Sunday.
through Sunday.
There's something for everybody.
You want to get up and show what you found? Joe? Joe Mangarella?
Hello. I have just acquired a box. It's a W.H. Baker's Sweet Chocolate, New York City, and Winchester, yeah, Virginia. 6-pound box. Doesn't sound very exciting, does it? Nice label on the end, same, tells the same thing. The reason I picked it up wasn't because it's a nice box, but it had this on the bottom. Yeah, Patron, Millbrook. And for those who don't know, he had a, what do you call it, mom and pop store, right across from the firehouse, or excuse me, the post office. And that would be the stone building. I don't even know who's in there now.
Well, landscaping firm is in there now.
It's the stone building with those white pillars, little quartz stone pillars, just before the door.
And that was a little grocery store, and then they lived over it.
And that would be the grandfather of Greg Patron, who I went to school with. And
So that was at the dump, or where'd you get it?
no, I got this at the Duchess Flea Market in Fishkill. It's outdoor flea market every Sunday. And it was, I had gotten there kind of early, and the box was just sitting on the table like that, upside down. And the first thing I saw was Millbrook, so I just walked over and looked at it. Oh, yeah, I saw the box, nice box. And I didn't even see notice the name as soon as I saw that. That's why I...
Was it on the dump?
No.
He might not have picked it up and moved that much.
Yeah. So, there it is. An artifact from their store.
Thank you. Are you keeping or donating?
Oh, yes. I have a collection of local stuff.
Okay, any other announcements anybody has? Well, then I'm going to turn it over to Robert McHugh, and he can get on with a good part of the program. Thank you, everybody.
All right, welcome everybody, thanks for coming, appreciate it. Let me just say, by way of introduction here, I've been a little bit under the weather the past few days, and I've been taking a cocktail of different cold medications that I don't think a medical professional would advise you to take in concert. So if I momentarily lose track of what I'm saying here, I beg your forbearance. I should also say, because this is a talk about the famous Quaker, I don't think it's appropriate for me to just stand up here and talk the whole time. I'm sure many of you know this, but the way Quaker meetings would work, people would come together, they'd sit in silence, and when the Spirit moved someone, they would say something, right? There was no liturgy that was followed. Right? It was pretty free-flowing. So feel free, if the Spirit moves you, to ask a question, shout out comments, whatever you feel like. Now, Lucretia Mott is probably the single most famous person, most consequential person in American history to have lived in our community, the town of Washington. She was here before there was a Millbrook, for about 3 years in the early 19th century, but I'm not sure there's a more impactful person in American history. who's lived where we live today. Before we get into her life, just a word or two on sources. Over the past 100 years or so, there have been 2 major biographies written about Lucretia Mott. 2 in 100 years. But before that, perhaps the most important book written about her was written in the late 19th century by her granddaughter. Here's Lucretia Mott with her granddaughter. Her granddaughter wrote a biography of both her grandmother and her grandfather, James Mott, right, Lucretia's husband, which is no longer in print today, of course. But when I was looking up information for this talk, I just stumbled upon this note online that said that the manuscript for this first biography of Lucretia Mott, one written by her own granddaughter, is at Vassar College, in the archives at Vassar. I'm assuming that probably the granddaughter went to Vassar, and that's why they have it, but I'm not 100% sure of that. So my research assistant, Sam, and I went to the Vassar College archives, made an appointment, and they were very happy and accommodating. In fact, the guy who worked there, who had been working there for decades, he said, we were the first people ever to request to look at this. So if you're inspired by this talk, I'd recommend going to the Vassar archives and asking for this. And you really get a sense, looking at the manuscript copy of it, of the personality of the person writing it. And you can see cross-outs and changes that have been made, right? Words substituted as you go through it. So that's a great document. If we look at the next slide, you can see how beautiful the handwriting is. So that was a major source for what I'm going to tell you tonight. And I'm really going to focus on 2 things. I have 2 goals for you. One, to give you a sense of Lucretia Mott's overall life and her contributions, but also really to focus in particular on the 3 years that she spent here in the town of Washington, and try to connect those 2 things, right? Her time here as a teenager with her broader career. Does that make sense? Sure. Any questions so far? All right. Let's keep it. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but Lucretia Mott was born in 1793 the island of Nantucket. She lived a very, very, very long life. I think you can get a sense of that from the picture with her granddaughter. Right? She lived till she was in her mid-80s. Right? Or another way of putting it, she was born when George Washington was president. She died the same year Douglas MacArthur was born. So she lived a long, long, long time. Right? But her life started in Nantucket. And I think it's appropriate that her life started in Nantucket, because that had an impact on her. Nantucket had been founded 150 years before by some of her ancestors, the Coffins, right? That's her maiden name. And there was a big Quaker community, right, on Nantucket. Her father, Thomas, was a sea ship captain, so he sailed around. He was involved in the whaling industry, which was big in Nantucket. And he was often gone for long stretches of time, right? A year or more. They didn't see him. There was one incident in particular where he was down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Chile, and his ship was seized by Spanish forces. That was pretty common in early American history. He decided, instead of just kind of abandoning the ship and coming home to his family, that he would stay in Chile, learn Spanish, so that he could then fight to get his ship returned to him in the Spanish courts. It didn't work. He did learn some Spanish, but he didn't get his ship back. After 3 years, he abandoned the effort and came home. His family in Nantucket, including his daughter Lucretia, assumed that he was just gone, that he wasn't coming back. They were surprised to see him when he showed up after 3 years. So because her father was often away, was more an absence than a presence in her life, her mother played a really important role. And this was true of Nantucket in general. Right? The whaling industry was so big there, men were often away. It was really a female-dominated society. And I think that's important when you think of her development. Her mother decided to open a store in Nantucket, right? So she wasn't just staying home with the family, raising the kids, she was working, she was running this store, right? Again, that had an influence on Lucretia, right? Lucretia, right, was always out of the house, always working later in life. Another person who had a big influence on her is a woman named Elizabeth Coggeshall. Elizabeth Coggeshall was what was called in the Quaker community a public friend. Right? So she was a woman who would travel around from Quaker meeting to Quaker meeting, different Quaker communities, and speak. Right? Kind of an itinerant Quaker minister in a way. But she had her own family. She was married. She had kids. But what happened with the Quakers, if you took on this position of being a public Quaker, an itinerant preacher, the Quaker community would come and help you raise your family. So here's another model for Lucretia's later life. Right? Here's a woman who is not staying home, is traveling around, right? Traveling even to England, right? As the community, right, took care of her family for her. So you really get a sense, just in these early years of her life on Nantucket, of what will happen later. Right? You see those early influences, I think, pretty clearly. When she was 11 years old, right, shortly after her father had returned from those 3 years away, they moved to Boston. Right? The father, Thomas, didn't want to go sailing for 3 years at a time anymore. He became a merchant, settled in Boston. And she spent 2 years there. She attended school, but there was a real conflict within the family. And I think this was true of a lot of Quakers during this period. They were relatively prosperous. And Quakers are all about equality, right? Quakers are rejectors of ostentation, right? We'll see that again in a minute. And the fact that they were living in Boston, in a pretty wealthy town, among a lot of non-Quakers, it kind of unsettled them a little bit. Right? The family actually debated whether Lucretia should go to public school or private school. Public school or private school. And she went back and forth between the two. Right? They weren't sure what was the right place for her. After 2 years in Boston, she came here. Right? What's depicted in this picture to where we are now. When she was 13, she was sent to the 9 Partners boarding school, right, in the town of Washington. Does everybody know where 9 Partners was? Maybe some of my students don't, but it's right over on 343, so it's probably a couple miles, maybe from where we are now, maybe not even that much. Right? So the building is not there anymore, but there's a historic marker at the spot. But this was a Quaker boarding school that had been opened up about 10 years or so before Lucretia arrived.
December 20th, 1796 it opened.
That is a very precise date. Exactly. She arrives, I think, in 1806. So it's relatively new at that point. And she's 13. She arrives with her younger sister, Eliza, who's a couple years younger, right, than she is. And to me, it's kind of fascinating how this worked, because the school actually sent detailed information to the families of the students who attended about what they should bring and what they shouldn't bring with them. Right? So here's what the family was told daughter should bring. 1 or 2 plain bonnets, 1 cloak, not silk, 2 stuff or gingham gowns suitable for the season, made plain, 3 or 4 long checked aprons, 1 pair of scissors, 1 pair of pins. Right? That's what they were supposed to bring. They were explicitly told that if the girls came with fancier attire, it would be shipped home. They wouldn't be allowed to keep it. They were told, don't bring money, don't bring novels, right? That stuff's not allowed. Right? At 9 Partners, there was no dancing, there was no music, there's no theater. Those things were seen as frivolous. But what there was at 9 Partners, which really didn't exist hardly anywhere else in the country, is there were educational opportunities for girls that were pretty much on par with what the boys received. Right? They received more or less the same education. Not exactly the same, but girls studied reading and writing and accounting and grammar and geography, right? Not just sewing and stuff like that. That was almost unique, right, in education in the early 19th century. Right? So the way the school was set up, right, it was highly segregated by sex, right, by gender. Right? So it's one building, but it's kind of split down the middle. Right? On one side, you have classes for the boys taught by a man. On the other side, you have classes for the girls taught by a woman. Right? Even kind of the recreational areas are separate, but the same curriculum. Right? Segregated by gender, but the same curriculum. You kind of also wonder, too, how segregated it really was. I kind of think, because I'm a teacher at Arlington, if a historian, 100 years or 200 years hence, reads our student handbook and says like, oh, kids aren't allowed to have cell phones in class, it says in the student handbook. That means no students had cell phones in class. Like, that would not reflect reality. So it's hard to know exactly when you're looking at kind of rules, how rigidly they're enforced. But I love this phrase. The goal was to, quote, prevent any improper familiarities. Right? And kids at boarding school love their improper familiarities. That was the goal. Let's go to the next image. This is a famous image here. This is another image of the school. I think this is painted by a member of the Thorne family around the time that Lucretia was there, maybe a few years later. You can see it looks similar. The next one, right, there's the sign that's there today. So not a mention of Lucretia Mott, but a mention of famous teachers and pupils. Let's go back. So Lucretia got into a lot of trouble at Nine Partners, at least according to her own kind of later recollections and what her granddaughter wrote. She liked to talk a lot. And sometimes the Quakers appreciated silence. She, in particular, from an early age, would like to argue with her teachers when they thought that, when she thought that a rule that they had put in place was unfair. She would argue with them. She wouldn't just like blindly accept the rule. She would say, well, why should we follow that rule? And like you can see her saying that as a 13-year-old, as a 14-year-old, and this is one of the defining characteristics of the next 65 years of her life. Right? You can see it at this early stage. At one point, she convinced her younger sister, Eliza, to sneak into the boys' section of the school because a boy had been punished for what she considered a trifling offense, and he had been locked in a closet as his punishment. Now, that might sound harsh today. I don't think we're allowed to lock students in closets anymore. But for the time, that's a relatively mild punishment. The people who ran Nine Partners rejected corporal punishment. They didn't beat the students, which would have been common in a lot of schools at the time. But Lucretia thought even that punishment, as mild as it was unfair. So according to her own account of this, she and her sister sneaked into the boys' section of the school, found this guy hiding in the closet and slipped him some like bread and butter under the door, right? Didn't bust him out completely, but maybe made it a little easier to pass the night in the closet. Now, what she learned at Nine Partners, yeah?
It was called the refractory room, and it was there for anybody to go to when they had broken sufficient number of rules that the teacher thought that it was necessary for them to be put into there. It was not big, it was not, I understood that it was slightly not ventilated, meaning it could get a little chilly at times in the winter. And they were not supposed to have any visitors, so Lucretia and whoever else was there.
Excuse me, we can't hear back.
No, I'm sorry.
Could you stand up?
Okay. It was called the refractory room, and it was where you were put in if you had violated sufficient number of rules that the teachers thought you were becoming a nuisance, or whatever it is term you want to call it. They were put into there in solitude. As I understood, there was not much light. It was not very well ventilated. They didn't get food, and you had to stay there until such time as they thought you had repented or whatever it was that your time was up. So for Lucretia to go into there, and this story is told in numerous sources, was considered highly irregular. There's also a story of another famous person who was there, famous not today's terms, but famous back then, who said that he actually used some of the leather from his shoes to make instruments to help him to make his way out of this room so he could escape, because it was such an awful punishment. But they didn't, as Robert just said, they did not do corporal punishment, although I do have one case of someone claiming to have been caned to there, but I haven't gotten confirmation on it. So it was a much more humane time in those days than in other places.
Thanks. So some of the stuff that she studied at Nine Partners, she would have been exposed to the works of Thomas Clarkson. Anybody know who Thomas Clarkson was? That name familiar to you? He was famous at the time. Certainly if you were a Quaker, you knew him. He was a British Quaker who was instrumental in the late 18th century, early 19th century, in his work against the slave trade. So he's one of the leading abolitionists in the world around this time. He's the guy who popularized this image, slave ship called the Brooks. And he used that as kind of propaganda against the slave trade, his campaign to end it. So from very early on in her life, Lucretia Mott is reading about the horrors of the slave trade, the horrors of slavery. She's seeing images like this, right? She's reading Thomas Clarkson. Later in her life, when she travels to England, she actually gets to meet Thomas Clarkson. He's in his 80s by this point, but it's one of the kind of thrills of her life.
Robert, one question. I don't think people realize what that's depicting. So explain what's in the picture.
Everybody see this is a slave ship, right? The Brooks. It was an image originally, I think, made by the owners of the ship to convey how efficient they are at shipping slaves, how tightly they can be packed in.
Those are slaves.
Chained in.
They were
But
there,
then it was
they're on their back.
co-opted by people like Clarkson, people who are in the abolitionist community, to highlight the horrors of slavery. So even when Lucretia Mott was old, she would tell her grandchildren about Thomas Clarkson, about reading this, about seeing these images. So this is something that really had an impact on her entire life, and it happened here at Nine Partners.
There were two known pictures on the wall because they didn't allow anything like that back in the school. This is one of the known ones, which is why it was so highly influential to her. They're stacked like cordwood, you know.
The other thing that had a big impact on her that she read at Nine Partners was a poem. One of the more popular poems from the time, called The Task by a guy named William Cowper. I don't think a lot of people read William Cowper's poetry today. He's largely forgotten, but in the early 19th century, he was incredibly popular. If you're really familiar with the works of Jane Austen was a big fan of Cowper. Sometimes her characters are talking about Cowper in their novels. And Lucretia Mott, right, was a big fan of Cowper. Memorized his poems, would recite them decades and decades later, right, to family members. And I just want to show you a stanza here from his most famous work, The Task. This is the kind of stuff Lucretia would have read, would have memorized while here at Nine Partners. It says, "And worse than all, and most to be deplored, as human nature's broadest, foulest blot, chains him and tasks him, and exacts his sweat with stripes, that mercy with a bleeding heart weeps when she sees inflicted on a beast. Then what is man? And what man, seeing this and having human feelings, does not blush and hang his head to think himself a man? I would not have a slave to till my ground, to carry me, to fan me while I sleep, and tremble when I wake, for all the wealth that sinews bought and sold have ever earned. No, dearest freedom is, and in my heart's just estimation, prized above all price. I had much rather be myself the slave and wear the bonds than fasten them on him." So this is the kind of stuff she would have read, right, while here. Another person who had influence on her while she was here at Nine Partners is a name that's pretty famous in Quaker circles, Elias Hicks. Right? He was one of the founders of Nine Partners, and he was a guy who, as a Quaker, was a committed abolitionist, thought it's not enough simply for you to free your own slaves, right? To be a moral person, you have to work to end slavery everywhere. That might seem like an obvious idea to us. At the time, that's a fairly controversial idea within the Quaker community. It eventually contributes to a split that happens within Quakerism. But Hicks had a big influence on Lucretia Mott, because Lucretia Mott, throughout her entire life, is not someone who says, my own personal morality is enough. If I'm good, that's enough. Right? She's trying to improve society. She's trying to perfect society. Right? And that's how Hicks kind of inspired her. Another person who had a big influence on her, she was at 9 Partners, was James Mott Sr. He was the superintendent of the school. Eventually, Lucretia Mott would marry his grandson, James. But James Mott Sr., he was so opposed to the institution of slavery that he would refuse to wear cotton. He would refuse to eat sugar. Right? He would wear wool. Right? He would sweeten his food with maple syrup. This is something that Lucretia did through much of her life and encouraged other people to do. Right? Something in her personal life that she could do to push back against the institution of slavery. James Mott Sr. published a book. His ideas about female education. Right? Stuff that he learned, right, at 9 Partners. And I just got this the other day. And some of this is great. This is kind of advice he's giving to young people. In relating what has happened, omit every circumstance that is not material. Neither indulge in digressions, which may render useful communication tiresome, nor relate marvelous things that may require proofs to be believed. When you are in company, try to bring the conversation to some useful subject. History, literature, and the customs of particular countries surely afford better and safer topics than dress, personal character, or such stories as afford no valuable information. This is great advice, right? As a history teacher, I kind of like this part. Although history affords much necessary and useful information, yet in many of the histories, both of ancient and modern times, the crimes and the vices of historic heroes are frequently so represented that the feeling mind is shocked on reading them. History often presents a disgusting, terrible list of crimes and calamities. Murders, assassinations, battles, and revolutions are the memorable events of history. The historian makes the love of glory atone for military barbarity. Treachery and fraud are frequently dignified with the names of prudence and policy. This is great stuff. So I think what we're doing here tonight is a little bit of what James Mott Sr. would have appreciated, right? We're not talking about wars. Now, Lucretia befriended, during her time at 9 Partners, James Mott Sr.'s granddaughter, Sarah Mott, who was a couple years younger. They became very, very close at 9 Partners. So close that Lucretia would go and stay with their family sometimes down in Mamaroneck. And it's probably there that she first really kind of came into contact with the man who would become her husband. Sarah's older brother, right, by 5 years, James Mott. Now, after a couple years at 9 Partners, when she was 15 years old, she had pretty much taken all the classes. You know, the way it was organized was a little bit different from a school today. There wasn't really an official start and an end to the school year. One of her biographers described it as like stepping on and off a carousel. Right? The school just kind of keeps moving, and when you show up, you step in, and then you leave, and it just keeps moving, right? But after about 2 years, she had taken all the classes, she had excelled in the classes, so they offered her a job as a teacher at the school, right? She's 15, turned 16. She becomes an assistant teacher on the girls' side of the school. One of the things that she discovers while working as a teacher is that she's not paid at all. She gets free room and board. free tuition for her sister, who's still a student there. But that she can live with. The woman that she's teaching with, kind of the head teacher, gets paid 40 pounds a year. The male teacher, James Mott, who she eventually marries, gets paid 100 pounds a year. Now their salaries change over time, but his is always higher. Now he's younger and less experienced than the woman teacher, but he's getting paid more than twice as much. From a young age, that struck Lucretia Mott as fundamentally wrong. And I'm happy to say that we have completely solved that problem today. No longer an issue. So it's probably while they're both working as teachers that they really can fall in love with each other. You know, the teachers, during Lucretia's year working as an assistant teacher, got together and would study French just for fun after class. So like their workday ended and then they said, oh, let's all get together and learn some French. And it's probably during those informal French sessions that they really came to know each other well, love each other. It's around this point when Lucretia Mott's father, Thomas, decides to move the family from Boston to Philadelphia, right? Boston is not really Quaker enough, right? Too Puritan. Philadelphia is where the big Quaker community is in the United States. So he decides to move the family down to Philadelphia. He's going to start a factory, nail factory down there. And Lucretia decides to join him, right? So she leaves 9 partners, leaves our community, right, to move down to Philadelphia, where she spends pretty much the rest of her life. But she's got one demand before she rejoins her family. She says to her father, I want you to find a job for James Mott, because he really doesn't like teaching, and he wants to do something else. So if I'm going to move down to Philadelphia, let's bring him down too. Right? Her father agrees, and shortly thereafter, they get married. Right? I think she's 18 when they get married. He's 5 years older, so he's 23. Questions so far? So I'll just say that her time in Millbrook is relatively short. It's not a huge chunk of her life. It's 3 years out of 86 or 87 years. But you can see in those 3 years some of the things that will define her life going forward. Commitment to abolitionism. Exposure to the idea that men and women are not being treated equally, and that is fundamentally unfair. She meets her husband there. They will stay married for 56 years, and for all of those 56 years, they are partners with each other, full partners, not just in marriage, but in reform. There's not an issue, really, that you can find where they're in disagreement with each other. Right? They have very different personalities, but they are a perfect match for each other. That happens right here in our community, that match.
Did they have children?
They had many children, and many grandchildren, and many great-grandchildren. Yeah, I mean, Lucretia lived so long that she got to know her great-grandchildren. I think they had 6 children. I don't know if that includes, there's some who passed away at an early age. But yeah, absolutely. So they go to Philadelphia, they start a family. When she has 2 young children, 9 months old and 2.5 years old, she goes to work, right, as a teacher. Again, not entirely typical, right, for that time period. But it's also around this time when she starts to speak up more in Quaker meetings. Right? She's going to these Quaker meetings in Philadelphia, and she's sharing her opinions. She speaks so often and so forcefully that they name her a minister, right? Kind of almost like an honorary title, right? She's not leading a liturgy or something like that, but she's someone whose opinions are respected, right? This is an honor for her. Right from the start, though, she makes waves. You know, there's this inherent contradiction that exists within Quakerism. Any religion is going to be based on rules, right? Here's what you're allowed to do. Here's what you're not allowed to do. Right? Any religion is going to be based on shared rituals, right? It has to be. But at the core of Quakerism is this idea that what trumps everything is your allegiance to your own kind of inner guiding light, right? That Jesus exists within every person, and that you have to be true to your own sense of right and wrong, divine inspiration. There's a kind of sovereignty of conscience that exists within Quakerism that makes it hard to keep everyone kind of on the same track. And that's definitely the case with Lucretia. Because although the Quakers are committed to equality, much more so than anyone else is at this time, they can also be fairly officious and have, in Lucretia's mind, kind of petty rules that they obsessively follow. You know, Quakers have kind of an equivalent of Catholic excommunication. You can be kicked out of the Quaker meeting. It's called disownment. Right? And people at this time in Philadelphia were being disowned for what Lucretia thought of as relatively trivial offenses. Going to listen to a talk by someone who was slightly scandalous. Right? Like encouraging your daughter to marry someone who wasn't a Quaker. Like that was a big one, right? Marrying outside of the Quaker community, that got you kicked out. But even like helping someone do that, that could get you kicked out. And Lucretia would speak up in these meetings saying like, do we really want to kick these people out? Right? Is that what this is about?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Didn't they have to ask their community if they could marry?
They
had
would.
to get permission to get married.
They would. And that certainly happened when Lucretia herself married. You know, they got permission from their parents, but then they had to go to the Quaker meeting in Philadelphia and say, like, do you approve of this? Do you bless this? And yeah, exactly. So, Lucretia is speaking up more and more in these meetings, playing a more active role. Eventually, she gets involved in speaking up against the institution of slavery. Her husband, James, had been a member of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. He had helped found schools for free blacks in Philadelphia. He was deeply involved in the cause, and so was Lucretia. Right? She, like her grandfather-in-law, commits to this idea of using free produce, no cotton, no sugar. Right? There's a free produce store in Philadelphia that only sells products that have no connection with slave labor, so Lucretia patronizes that store. Right? And she's speaking about these issues at Quaker meetings, incredibly controversial. In the early 1830s, William Lloyd Garrison, famous abolitionist, the guy who's probably the most famous white abolitionist in American history, stops by Philadelphia and visits Lucretia Mott, who was gaining a reputation as an outspoken critic of slavery. William Lloyd Garrison is 25 years old. He's just got out of prison in Baltimore, where he was put for slandering a slave owner, right, in a newspaper that he worked on. Every prominent person that you can think of from mid-19th century America had some connection with Lucretia Mott. Like, it's hard to find a reformer who she didn't know, who didn't come to her house, right? Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. John Brown's widow stayed with the Motts after her husband's execution. I mean, everybody is visiting them. Everybody knows this family. They're so prominent. But it's while William Lloyd Garrison is with the Motts in the early 1830s that something important happened. It's not clear exactly what, but the big debate in abolition at this time was between those supporters of colonization. Oh, I've got water. I don't know that that's going to help. Is my voice sounding worse and worse as we go on here? All right, how's that? A lot better, right? The big debate that exists within the abolition movement at this time is between what's called colonization and immediatism. Colonization said, all right, maybe slavery's bad, but what are we going to do once slavery is over? Right? They could envision an end to the institution of slavery. They could not envision the reality of a biracial America. Right? But pretty much every prominent opponent of slavery in the early 19th century, was a supporter of that plan, colonization. William Lloyd Garrison and Lucretia Mott are two of the first outspoken supporters of the other path forward, immediatism. This idea that you can't gradually end slavery, you can't send free blacks to Africa. They envisioned an immediate end to slavery and a biracial America, right, where blacks and whites lived in relative equality. I cannot state strongly enough how radical an idea that is at the time, right? The small minority of northern whites are abolitionists. Like even being a supporter of colonization, that's like a minority position. So this is a subset, right, of a minority. So it's not clear how they came to that decision, but they are with each other, they're talking to each other around the time that that commitment to immediatism on both their behalves emerges.
Excuse me, had she seen blacks here in Millbrook? Where did she first see a black face?
Wonderful
I mean,
question.
alive.
So there definitely would have been free blacks in Nantucket when she was growing up. No slaves, but free blacks working in the whaling industry. At the time that she was living in the town of Washington, there are people who were enslaved here. I mean, if you look at the census, I'm not sure if she would have come into contact with them as a student at the school. My thinking is probably no, but there was a free black community.
But there's
Near
also
there, right?
slaves. Philip Hart, everyone knows that's where we live, in Hart's Village. Philip Hart had a slave, and through 1790, 1800, 1810, his wife was Quaker. And the Quakers justified Philip having a slave because he was a worldly Baptist. That's written down in the document. So there were slaves in the area. The Quakers, though, as you have said, insisted that we are all made in God's image, and that no one person can own another. So that was the conflict in the area.
So she would have
She would
encountered probably both free blacks and slaves. So right after this meeting with Garrison, as this idea of immediatism, that slavery is a moral abomination that needs to be ended this day, and that idea takes hold. Garrison decides to form an organization called the American Anti-Slavery Society. And the forming of that organization took place in Philadelphia, where Lucretia Mott was living. Her husband, James, was an official delegate, right, to the founding of this convention. Lucretia was not because she wasn't outspoken or committed, but because she was a woman. But she did go to the meeting and spoke frequently and eloquently about abolition. She suggested changes to their founding charter that they were creating, their mission statement essentially. Their mission statement was so radical, it called not just for an immediate end to slavery, but it called for full racial equality, right? A radical idea in 1833. It was so radical that after they finished drafting it, even some of the people who had participated in the drafting, who were there at the convention, were a little gun shy about signing their names to it. So according to legend, Lucretia Mott, who was in the crowd, yelled out, while it looked like people were gun shy about signing this thing, "James, put down thy name." Right? Yelled to her husband. He did, others followed, and the American Anti-Slavery Society was created. Because she couldn't participate directly in that, she helped found a parallel organization for women in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, where she worked with both white and black women in Philadelphia, people from all different religious traditions. Right? That part was probably the most controversial to the Quakers. Not that you would work with, a free black woman, but that you would work with, God forbid, a Unitarian. That was scandalous. Quakers. One of the members of the group, by the way, was Abba Alcott, who was the mother of Louisa May. Now, she and her husband helped organize anti-slavery conventions in Philadelphia. One in particular in 1838. There's so much opposition to it Oh, I forgot we had slides. So here they are. Here they are. This is one of the earlier pictures of them together. They're in their late 40s here. Late 40s, I think. Keep going. Oh, this is great. This is Lucretia Mott at the very end of her life. Probably someone sent away to ask for her autograph, and this is what she sent back. In a true marriage relation, the independence of the husband and the wife is equal, their dependence mutual, and their obligations reciprocal. And that really defined their marriage. Here they are in one of their groups. It's a biracial group. Here's what happened when they organized an anti-slavery convention in Philadelphia, a northern city. A mob of thousands of people gathered, set fire to the building where they were supposed to meet. The fire department looked on, didn't do anything to put it out. Right? This is a radical position that they're taking. A couple years after this happened, an anti-slavery convention was held in London. It was supposed to be a world anti-slavery convention in 1840. Lucretia and her husband both went. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was there as well. But women were entirely excluded from it. Right? They weren't allowed to be delegates. They weren't even allowed to sit near the men. They weren't allowed to speak at the convention. Right? And it's often seen as a turning point, not just in her life, but in the push for women's rights as well. Right? All these women who are deeply committed to abolition, being told that they're not able to participate in the same way that men are, they start to say, well, why are we just fighting for abolition? Why are we just fighting to end slavery? Why aren't we fighting for ourselves as well? Key turning point. Amen. Thanks, Linda. Now, she met a lot of opposition wherever she would go. She'd travel frequently around the United States, speak at different Quaker gatherings. It was routine for her to be denied service at inns, right? We don't want you here. There's one incident in which the carriage that she was riding in, somebody tampered with the wheels to try to make her go off the road. I mean, she was a radical and controversial figure, but she was gaining in renown. A couple years after coming back from that London conference, she traveled to Washington, D.C., right, a slave city, right, in the 1840s. And she gave a speech in which she addressed 40 members of Congress. So here's a woman speaking to 40 members of Congress. Ralph Waldo Emerson just happened to be there at the speech. And he said, listening to her speak, it was like the rumble of an earthquake, the sensation that attended that speech. So that's Emerson, a guy who has a lot of experience giving public addresses. I think one of the reasons why maybe Lucretia Mott doesn't get quite the attention that some other 19th century reformers do, maybe a little bit less known than, say, Susan B. Anthony or someone like that, is because she didn't really write stuff down too often. She sent a lot of letters to family members, but they were about family issues. Right? Whenever people would ask her to write about women's rights or contribute a chapter to a book, she would always demur. She was a great and powerful speaker, but some of that power has been lost through history because she didn't write an account of her life that Frederick Douglass did, or someone like that. But certainly listening to the people who described the experience of hearing her speak in person, it was a powerful, powerful thing. While she was there in Washington speaking to these members of Congress, she just happened to stop by the White House. I think you could do that in the 1840s. And the president at the time, John Tyler, Tippecanoe and Tyler 2 fame, saw her. And she started to debate him about slavery. And he tried to take the colonization line. All right, I understand maybe slavery's got to end sometime, but let's do it gradually. Let's send free blacks to Africa, right? And she said, absolutely not. And he thought that he could trap her by saying, okay, once we abolish slavery, how about we just send all the free blacks to Philadelphia and they can live with you, right? And she said, if they want to, sure, why not, right? Kind of boxed him in. He was so flummoxed by her that he said, I'm going to send you over to talk to John C. Calhoun. You should be debating him. Calhoun, of course, the great champion of slavery, apologist for slavery. So abolition is at the core of what she's doing, but she is involved in all kinds of different reforms. The only person who's a member of more different organizations than Lucretia Mott that I've ever met is David. right? Irons in the fire than Lucretia Mott. But she's involved in raising money for Philadelphia's poor. She's organizing relief for victims of the Irish famine. Right? She joins a movement called the anti-Sabbatarian movement. Right? Quakers tended to believe that like Sunday wasn't so special, that every day of the week is holy. But a lot of places had rules about like you can't do this on Sunday. Right? She thought that was ridiculous. That was the only day that workers got off usually. Right? They should be allowed to do something. Oh, thank you. It probably sounds worse than it feels. She said this. I think this is a great line. Why is it worse to sew on a Sunday than to sell a man on a Tuesday? But by the late 1840s, her focus had really become women's rights. She was still involved in all these other reform movements. She never abandoned them or put them aside, but she added this push for women's rights to her docket of reforms. How many people have heard of the Seneca Falls Convention? Everybody know Seneca Falls? All right. So this is the first women's rights movement. We teach about this in U.S. history. Everybody learns about it, right? They ask about it on the Regents exam even. To me, it was fascinating to read about this because it was just Lucretia Mott traveling to Western New York. She was visiting Seneca Indians. That was another one of her interests, right? How Native Americans were being treated. So she was visiting Seneca Indians in Western New York, and her friend from the Anti-Slavery Convention in London, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was living in Seneca Falls, had just moved there from Boston, was kind of bored. Life in a small town was a lot more dull than Boston. So she stops by to visit Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they start talking about how they should actually have this convention that they've been discussing 8 years before. They met on July 13th, 1848. 6 days later, the convention is held, right? Like the lead time for this is incredible, right? They put this thing together so quickly, this momentous event in American history. 100 people come, right? Frederick Douglass is there, right? It's at this convention that they draft the Declaration of Sentiments, right? Their version of the Declaration of Independence that is inclusive of women. That is a list of all the grievances perpetrated against women, right, by men in early 19th century America, right? Lucretia Mott at the Seneca Falls Convention spoke the most, right? Was the first to sign the Declaration of Sentiments, right? She was one of the key players at this convention. Now, she lives another 32 years after Seneca Falls, but don't worry, we're not going to cover all those 32 years. I'll just kind of leave you with this. This is from a speech that she gave the year after Seneca Falls, 1849. And unlike most of her speeches, this was one that was actually taken down by people, that was turned into a pamphlet and distributed. So we have it today. It's called A Discourse on Woman. Right? And she says this: the question is often asked, what does woman want? More than she enjoys. What is she seeking to obtain? Of what rights is she deprived? What privileges are withheld from her? I answer, she asks nothing as favor, but as right. She wants to be acknowledged a moral, responsible being. She is seeking not to be governed by laws in the making of which she has no voice. It's that kind of moral clarity cutting through the pablum, some of these quackish reform movements that are popular in the 19th century, that really defines her life. Whether it's abolition, whether it's women's rights, whether it's the freedom to do what you want on a Sunday, right? And a lot of that starts, right, when she's 13 years old, when she's 14 years old, right, here in Washington, here in our community, when she's first exposed to a lot of those ideas. Thank you very much. Wait, I have one more picture. Keep going. Keep going. Right here. This is a statue of Lucretia Mott, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. That's in the Capitol Rotunda. Right? So for a long time, not a lot of statues of women in the Capitol. Actually, this was commissioned at the time that the 19th Amendment was ratified, but for about 75 years, it was kept in the basement. But in the mid-90s, they moved it upstairs, where people actually go, and display it there. So now she graces
Is this in Albany?
No, this is in Washington.
Washington,
This is in
D.C.
Washington, D.C., yeah. So now she graces the Capitol, along with such great figures from American history as Jefferson Davis. So we'll end on that. We'll end on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions, or do you want snacks? I got Mott's applesauce. She has no connection. There's 24 containers of Mott's applesauce. If you need something for lunch tomorrow. Yeah.
Did any of her children carry on with her zeal?
During her lifetime, her whole family was involved in reform. Her sister was deeply involved in women's rights, Martha. I'm not going to directly answer that question, but I'll say this, that one of the great kind of sadnesses of her life was that her children and her grandchildren abandoned Quakerism. They married outside of the Quaker community, they became Unitarians or, whatever. So her descendants tended to not stay in the Quaker community. The granddaughter wrote the biography of her and became a writer, but not in the same way that she was. Any questions?
Thank you, Robert. That was amazing.
Thank you very much.